And welcome back to Irish America Magazine. I'm Tom Deignan. Today it is our pleasure to welcome National Book Award winner, Irish born, New York living, and all around amazing human being, Colum McCann. He is here to talk about his new book, American Mother. It's a bit of a departure for him in some ways, but not in others. It's actually consistent with what is one of the most impressive literary careers of the 21st century. Colum, welcome back to Irish America.
So happy to talk to you, Tom.
Anytime. We've known each other for far too long, and I'm really looking forward to this. The new book is called American Mother. It is astonishingly well timed, even though that's not really the right phrase. Just can you, it's better if you kind of just set this up. Tell us how you got involved, who is the American mother of the title, and why did she make this amazing decision that you write about?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. So the American Mother is a woman by the name of Diane Foley, and we would know her as the mother of James Foley, because he was the subject of probably the second most iconic photograph of the early part of the 21st century. Um, After the towers coming down, people generally recognize the photo of him uh, in the Syrian desert in an orange jumpsuit with a balaclava killer beside him, and the series of images and video that came out of his beheading in 2014. I got to meet Diane through a series of wonderful coincidences, and 7 years after her son's killing, she made the decision to go to Washington, D.C. and Virginia and to meet her son's killer. He was one of the British born jihadists known as the Beatles, and he and his colleague had been captured in northern Syria, stripped of their British citizenship, brought over here, and went on trial. A part of his plea agreement was that he would talk to the victims and the families of victims. And Diane, who is this incredible woman, this American mother, went and sat not 4 feet from him, and we talked with him together for 2 days at first, and then 6 months later we talked to him for one more day before he went off to maximum security prison, where he now is in Florence, Colorado. An extraordinary story about forgiveness, compassion, anger, loss, violence. A tale really for our times, almost mythical in the sense that, you know, here's a woman who goes and sits with the man who took her son's life, wrote his last words. All of these things coming together. For me, it was one of the most profound human moments that I've experienced in a long, long time. And it is a departure. You're absolutely right. It's my first real serious engagement with nonfiction. Um, and but I have no I don't see a difference, all that much of a difference between fiction and nonfiction. It all has to be true. It all has to be proper. It all has to have the right word placed in the correct place, and moment. And I feel privileged to have gotten a chance to work on this story.
There is so much to talk about in terms of all that you just introduced. Just to lay the groundwork a little bit more, what part of the country, what part of America does the Foley family come from?
So I drove I drove up from New York, where I live, to New Hampshire to go spend a couple of days with them. At first, this is how I discovered that she was about to go meet her son's killer. So they're from the New England part of the world, and yet they have this Irish connection. I mean, Jim Foley gives it away, but I also think that Jim was had an Irish spirit. He was a great reporter. He was the sort of fellow who went into, he'd go into the marketplace and he'd find the older man in the corner of the marketplace playing chess, or he'd find the young girl with a backpack full of school books, and he looked for the sort of anonymous corners of human experience to write about it, not just the big policy issues. And he embedded himself with the 101st Airborne in Afghanistan, and in fact, that's where some of this story came from, because on the same day that I saw the iconic photograph of him, that horrible photograph of him being beheaded, Friends of mine also sent me a copy of another photograph of him in Afghanistan, sitting in a bunker, very happily reading a book, which happened to be a book that I wrote called Let the Great World Spin. And oh, look at that
It
right
took my
there.
line.
Wow. And it was one of those moments when I had to reconcile these two things, and I felt this deep kinship with Jim Foley. The more I got to know him, I never met him, of course. The more I got to know him, um, and the more alive he becomes, in Diane's words, the more I think he's actually sometimes, Tom, that he's sitting here on my shoulder, whispering in my ear.
Yeah, I literally can't imagine what it must be like to have a person uh that has done all the things that Jim Foley did, and we'll talk about him more in a second, but and to sort of for him to sort of engage you in that way, and all the horrible things the family went through, to see a photo of him reading not only a book by you, but a book that is very much about forgiveness, and a book that is about violence, and a book that is about living with these things, and a book that is ultimately about understanding that these things have not just started happening, that this is, we're reading this as we know the Middle East is falling apart, but it was
Right.
falling apart in many ways when James Foley was there.
Right.
And that's no comfort in any way, shape, or form. It's just a simple truth, and in some ways it really, it makes more urgent what your book and what Diane Foley is talking about. Is maybe to some degree it is in our hands to stop some of this stuff. And so I guess that's a good part to maybe tell us what you thought. Diane Foley, Jim's mom, makes this decision. I am going to talk to my son's killer. um what role have we established? Cody, right? Cody is the
That's right.
person in the book. Not to get too into grim details, but I guess in some to some degree we must. What is the specific role he played in this murder?
Okay, so well, there's a lot there to unpack, and you're particularly correct about, the our challenge now to try to understand one another, and to understand what's going on abroad, in order to maybe change things on the ground, or change things certainly within ourselves. Um, Cody was born in London, went to Syria, became a fighter. Um, you know, converted to Islam, and then was captured many years later. He was most likely, like 90%, not the person to actually pull the knife across Jim's throat, but he 100% was the person who wrote the death notice that Jim had to read before he was killed. And I would say 99% certain that he was there, even though he claims that he was not there on the actual day. Um, and so he's a powerful force in the story. But here's the interesting thing. So Diane goes down. She asked me to go down with her. It's 2021, and we walk into a courthouse in Virginia. And into the middle of a courthouse. There's no windows, a huge room, a windowless room, with lots of tables and chairs. And there's FBI agents, and there's FBI agents, there's security guards, there's prosecutors, there's defense, there's all sorts of people in the room. And then she and I go and walk over to this room where he's sitting in his prison duds with shackles on his ankles, and he's reading Patrick Radden Keefe's book, Say Nothing. And it was really, really sort of extraordinary. And then the whole room disappeared, in the sense that when Diane and I were talking to him, we sat and we looked him in the eye. And I'm not going to say that I liked him, but I did begin to understand him. And he was a lot more clever than people had led him on. We were led to believe he was a soccer hooligan. He was, he didn't have any morals. He didn't have any thoughts about what was going on, and he just became radicalized and became brutal. And it wasn't quite that way. And we had to deal with the fact that Diane and I, for the first time, we took a break after talking to him for about 2 hours. We came outside, we were having a cup of coffee, and we both said, wow, he's a lot different than what we had expected. Um, and there were moments in those days which are portrayed in this book when everybody in that room falls into tears, including Cody, the jihadist himself. And Diane cries in public for the very first time since her son's death. And so there are a lot of emotion, a lot of complicated things going on. But at the same time, we're also telling the story of Diane's background and also telling about her incredible engagement with the landscape of hostage taking, the morality of all of these things, and how she has changed the whole landscape of how we deal with hostages around the world. And as you say, goes to the heart of what's going on right now in the Middle East and Gaza and other places around the world. So it's a very topical, powerful story.
And as such, it's gotten play on CNN, and it's whirling around the world as we speak because it is so incredible. Let me remind the listeners, you're welcome to Irish American Magazine. I'm Tom Deignan. We're talking to Colum McCann. His new book is American Mother. It is about Diane Foley, whose son was beheaded, journalist beheaded. And she has essentially, she writes and Colum writes about that experience as a way to sort of build towards trying to lessen, if not somehow possibly stop, this level of conflict. I do have to, that's Diane's going to get a lot of the attention here, deservedly so. Colum, I have two tough questions for you in terms of putting this story together. What was it like for you as a parent to watch Diane confront her child's murderer or someone who was involved in the murder? And also as an Irishman, this is you come out of a culture, a country, a nation that has its own serious history of violence and violence as a means to an end. As a parent and as an Irishman, what was this experience like?
Well, as a parent, I just had to look at Diane, and I had to try and measure the sort of level, the genius level of compassion that she brought to the situation, which is hard for us to understand. I don't know if I would have the same sort of power within myself if God forbid, I was ever to lose my one of my kids in a similar situation. It was amazing to talk to her and and see her as a parent, also as a daughter, also as a wife, also as a mother, all of these different things that were going on, and to see her figure out what she wanted to do herself because she wasn't entirely sure. Like, why am I here? Am I here to forgive him? Am I here to propel the legacy of my son? Am I here to say you did not actually kill my son because, excuse me, my son is alive in his story and alive in the way that the landscape of hostage taking is changing. All of these things that were going on. As an Irishman, I definitely felt it, and I think we do understand conflict in a more nuanced way than certain other people can understand it. Because I'm looking at Cody; he's a young Brit, and yet he's aligning himself with the Irish nationalist ideas. He's, as I said, he's reading Patrick Radden Keefe's Saying Nothing. He wanted to ask me about the Irish political situation and the structure of the IRA and things like that were fascinating to him. And he said I was a soldier. I did what I did in the fog of war, and Diane had to sit there and listen to these things. And we knew that he was lying at some times, and we knew then at other times he was being transparently, like, and almost transportedly true. Um, and when he talked about his own kids and things like that. So it was one of those moments where all of the human emotions, all of the ineffable things were on display: love and pride, pity, compassion, sacrifice, violence, hatred. All of those things were there in those particular moments, and trying to parse through them was a complicated thing for me as a writer and indeed as a parent.
And I have to say, in reading about Diane and Jim, just on my own level, his background is quite similar to my own. Born around the same time, interest in telling stories, interest in writing, and joins Teach for America. I think that's a
Exactly.
part of the story that might fall by the wayside. I was part of a similar initiative in New York City, trying to get people into underserved schools in need. I've been teaching in New York City high schools and colleges for 20 years now through a program called Teaching Fellows. We talked about Diane. What did you learn about Jim Foley, talking to Diane, talking to other people, and writing this story?
You're entirely right. He's very much like you and me. And actually, there's a lot of young people, young journalists in particular, who have gone out and gone on a limb, it doesn't get talked about all that much. All this goodness that goes on in the world. Like Jim worked with juvenile delinquents and did, as you say, worked his Teach for America stuff. He put himself on the line. He was interested in others. He wasn't interested in Jim Foley. He didn't have to. He wasn't going to tell his life story. He was talking about other people, and he wanted to bring home the story of the Syrian people to the American people because he said it was complicated. He also wanted to talk about the soldiers. He was a patriot, but the sort of patriot who was willing to criticize the things that were going on around him. And sometimes this story doesn't get told because it hits the white page with white ink, and because it doesn't have any relief, doesn't have any darkness. There are a lot of people out there doing really, really, really good things who don't necessarily get talked about. Unfortunately, it often is something terrible that happens that has to bring it to light. But happiness is a hard thing to write about.
It's so odd, and what you say is absolutely true. And you used another strange word, what has become a provocative word. You use the word nuance, and you worry that people aren't interested in nuanced stories anymore.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
it's on. I mean, that would be troubling.
Well, here's the thing. We're living in a time which is, as you know, completely diseased with certainty. You come into the room, if you look like me, or you sound like me, or you vote like me. Otherwise, you stay out of the room. This is what people are saying, and we have these very narrow lines of certainty, and people are afraid to say, "I don't know." People are afraid to say, "Oh, this stuff is messy." People are afraid to say that this stuff is full of contradictions, and I think one of the things that Diane knows, sort of intuitively, is that she needed to tell this story in order to say. This stuff is more complicated than what we give certain attention to. And now I learned this through writing a Paragon, which was my previous novel about Israel and Palestine, where the characters of the book, Rami and Bassam, basically taught me their philosophy, which is, we don't need to love each other. We as supposed enemies don't need to love each other. We don't actually need to even like one another, though you'd hope that we could do. But we absolutely must understand one another. We must, or we're doomed. So what Diane does is she goes down and she talks to her son's killer to try to understand what it was that he did, why he did it, and also to let him understand what he took from the world. Because one of the things that she wanted to do was say, my son was a good person. And you two, she said to you two might even have been friends. He would have understood you. And one of the reasons she goes down is she feels that Jim Foley would have wanted her to go down to talk to the killer. This is one of those sort of like Shakespearean Hamlet moments, where he actually comes back. Um, in a weird way, Tom, I mean, I have to say this, I haven't really talked about this, but I felt Jim operating through me. The minute I met Diane and John, they both said to me within a couple of hours that they were reminded of Jim, that I reminded them of Jim, and so there was a big responsibility for me. And I still feel that responsibility to get his story out into the world. Not that he's some sort of saint or anything like that. He would have hated being portrayed as a saint. I mean, the things that he did were tough and reckless and brave and profound. And what's going on in his name now is equally sort of profound.
I think one thing potential readers of this book may want to know is this is obviously neither of us are sort of ignoring the fact that this is a brutal subject.
Right.
But when you read about Diane, or if you see interviews with her, one thing she is not is overly somber, overly earnest. There is an energy that comes through her, call it what you will, resolve. I'll actually ask you to describe it. But one thing it is not is sort of that sort of like somberness or wallowing. It
Yeah.
is it's very appropriate and very fitting for the topic at hand in many ways. What stands out to her about you? What stands out to you about her?
Oh, well, here's the thing that really stands out is, and people haven't really talked a whole lot about this, and it might get me into dangerous territory. This is a feminist book. I mean, I really do think this is a book about a woman who lost her son when she was in her 60s. And now in her 70s, she's knocking on doors. She's knocking on President Biden's door. She criticizes the Obama administration very vocally, in this book. This is a woman who inspires change. I think she understands that sentiment without action is possibly the ruin of the soul. And her faith drove her and still drives her to change the world, because she is in that sort of habit of hoping. This is an American idea, I think. This habit of hoping that things can actually change, and out of all the desolation, can you find some tiny form of solace? And that's what I get from her. She's a bright, fun-loving person, but she's also very serious at the same time too.
And I think you put your finger on it. I guess what comes through is talk is only so much, that something has to be done. There is, as you alluded to earlier, it's very clear that everyone can talk. Everyone can have an opinion. We have very much established that.
Yeah,
It may be time, and I think what comes through in reading Diane is like she is interested in getting out there and doing stuff that's not pretty, that's not performative, that is, tightening nuts and bolts. And
right.
it just so happens that that's the stuff that actually accomplishes things. You mentioned sort of the certainty in the air these days, just this sort of disease of certainty. Well, what play did I see last night, but John Patrick Shanley's Doubt, which is
Oh,
now on Broadway. I don't ultimately know. Critics and theater goers will have their say, but I know its message about doubt, the idea that we should ask ourselves some questions sometimes. I think that's a very timely one, just like your book is very timely. Um, do you think? What would be your take on sort of that? And are you optimistic moving forward? Do people like Diane give you some optimism, given that there's so much reason to be pessimistic as you look around?
yeah. This is really interesting. Look, I think in the end, you have to be, well, certainly I have to be an optimist, but in order to be a really, really good optimist, you better be a good pessimist first. And you better understand all the pessimism, you better understand all the arguments that the cynics bring. And let's face it, nearly all the arguments that the cynics and the pessimists have are true. The world is brutal. We are dark. We are inhumane to one another. All of these things are going on. And then you acknowledge that, and let it play out, and you could say, well, that's enough, therefore I'm a pessimist. But what I say is, so what? That's no great revelation to say that the world is this real, horror show. The real revelation comes in saying, what are you going to do about it? How are you going to vault away from it? So it's like the Italian social scientist Gramsci. He sort of had this construction whereby you'd be a pessimist of reality, and an optimist of the will. So, in other words, the world is dark. So what? Now go ahead and try to do something. And the funny thing is, you and I both know that there are a ton. I really want to curse, but I won't. But a four-letter word, uh, of there's a beep ton of people who are doing really, really good work that don't necessarily get acknowledged, because the edges have become so defined, and the walls and the edges have become so defined. And those of us who are in the murky middle, of us who are in the purple places, sort of get ignored. And it's our uh, Diana is saying it's our obligation to get out there and to do something about this, to scuff up the world again. all those shiny little pieces that get presented to us are not actually true.
And Diane is doing that, and you are definitely doing that with this book. We've been talking to Colum McCann, Irish author, about his latest book, American Mother, which is, I wasn't sure, but you say it's your first nonfiction book, correct?
Correct. Well, I wrote a book called Letters to a Young Writer, which is kind of a nonfiction book, but this is my first sort of journalistic take. And you know, all so I'm not. But even though the last one, A Paragon, was very close to nonfiction, it sort of flirted with the notion of what is fiction and what is nonfiction. In fact, I kind of believe it's all about storytelling now, and that you know that ancient Irish form of you know, the myths are as true as you know, some of the things that the newspapers want to say. So for me, it's all complicated, but beautifully complicated, in the sense that the world is held together with stories. You know, yes, it's held together with atoms and molecules and all those different things, muons and gluons and quarks and so on. But really, when it comes down to it, it's held together with your story, my story, and everybody else who's out there listening, because we're actually laced in all of this together. And until we realize that and start to try and really understand other people, and that's one of the reasons I have a nonprofit that I'm very deeply involved in called Narrative 4, where we bring young people together to swap stories with one another and to step into one another's shoes.
You are a great interviewer because you stole two. Just want to get in two more quick questions before you leave. Can you tell me a little bit about Narrative 4? How long has it been around? How did you get involved with it, and what does it do?
It's 10 years old this year, and it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger all the time. Uh, as I said, we go into schools. We use teachers. Teachers are my heroes. We use teachers to sort of bring young people together, often from diverse backgrounds. So, say kids from the South Bronx exchanging stories with kids from Eastern Kentucky. Can you imagine what that is and how scared they are of one another at first? You know, these kids here primarily black and or immigrant, these kids here primarily white and or Cherokee. These kids here urban, these kids rural, these kids blue in terms of politics, these kids Trumpy, whatever way you want to characterize them. They come together, they're terrified of one another until they tell one another their stories. And the trick to Narrative 4 is you tell my story and I tell yours. So you and I get together, Tom. I come back to the group and I say, "Hi, my name is Tom Deignan," and and then you get to say, "Hi, my
My
name is
name is
Colum McCann,"
Colin McCann.
yeah. And you tell my story. And that's an act of it's a leap of empathy, and it really changes things for people, and we begin to understand each other in new and sort of profound ways. And I love this organization, and it takes up half my life now. The writing is the other half, and then Narrative 4 is the other half.
And to close things out, we spoke earlier. You promised that there is a new novel on the way.
Yeah, I'm
What,
finishing.
can you tell us a little bit about that?
That's why I'm in this messy office. Anybody who's able to see the image, like, look how crazy this is. Here's my stack of papers. Actually, there's the title. Twist.
Okay, that might be an exclusive right here and now.
It is. Um, and here's my
What's what?
editor's notes. Like, I've got
Be
all
careful.
sorts of notes.
The New Yorker might screenshot that.
But
What's
I'll
what's
tell you,
what's the basic gist? What's the conflict? What's the setting? What can you tell us? Irish background at all in the new one?
there's an
Twist.
Irish background because there's an Irish narrator, and it's set on and believe it or not, an internet repair ship, a boat out at sea. It's kind of like a retelling of Conrad's Heart of Darkness and a little bit of the Great Gatsby thrown in, you know, here and there.
So
And
not very ambitious.
it's pretty well, yeah. Who knows? It might fall on his face, but it takes place in a boat that goes out from South Africa and goes to repair a deep sea fault uh, at the mouth of the Congo River. And it's an Irish reporter who's on the boat and an Irish captain on the boat, and it becomes about the repair of the internet, but it also becomes about sabotage of the internet too.
I'll tell you, I can't wait to read it. I'll tell you my own little teaching story to close out. I used to teach, I haven't taught it in a little while. I used to teach Gatsby. And what I used to do is I would read with the students. Actually, when the movie came out, we read the first half of the book and then I set it aside. I said, kids, we're going to take a trip and see the movie. We're going to see the ending. I'm not going to let you see how this ends. And I thought I was a genius because, that's the hook, right? Well, I
Right.
was a genius. They were really into it, but they were extremely angry at me because it sucked them in. And I guess they just were waiting for that happy ending. And I don't think
Right.
it's a spoiler to say The Great Gatsby doesn't have the happiest of endings.
It
But
doesn't.
what it does show is the point you made earlier that you wouldn't think this story about wealthy white New York people flopping around Long Island would have any impact on 21st century Brooklyn kids, and it did.
Oh, it does. Yeah, those stories. And this is the thing that we got to keep on telling our stories because this is what we have to look. A lot of things will be taken away from us. They might even take books away from us, Tom. I mean,
They're working at
uh,
it.
but you never take the story, ever, ever. You cannot remove. You cannot take it. Death can take away a lot of things. It still cannot take away your story, and I think that's
Uh,
really important.
And I will put in my final plug. We have been talking to Colum McCann. If you're looking for two great books to read, the first one you must read is American Mother. It is about Jim and Diane Foley, mom and son, who are trying to make something useful out of something terrible. And one of the 50 amazing things about this story is that James Foley, the journalist, there was a photo of him reading Colum McCann's book, Let the Great World Spin. That, if you have not read it, that should be the second book. If someone had written a novel about someone like Jim Foley reading a book like this one, they probably wouldn't believe it. It's only the type of thing that real life could give us, because it's too good. And the books are amazing. They're not easy, but in this sense, look around the world, as we've been saying, look around the world. It's not an easy world. Um, but the thing I would say, my ultimate plug would be Let the Great World Spin, and American Mother. Don't stop it. Things are really, really hard. They don't stop at that. They say, then what? And I think we're in agreement that that's what we all have to do.
Thank you. Okay.
Colum, thank you so much for being with us on Irish
You.
America Magazine. Great to see you. Looking forward to seeing you again. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure, Tom.
Bye bye.